personality implications, recall was both very good and clustering was at a very high level. They did recall all the religious behaviors together and all the sociable behaviors together and all the athletic behaviors together. When they were asked to form an impression of the person, they also remembered those behaviors quite well, comparable levels of memory, but they didn't show very much clustering. That's clustering barely above what you'd expect by chance. And similarly, when they were asked to memorize these behaviors, they showed pretty good memory. This is a very common result in these in-person memory experiments, that memory is better when people are asked to form an impression of the person than it is when they're simply asked to memorize the items. It's quite an interesting result. But memory's pretty good here. They're recalling about 50% of the items. But again, clustering is at a relatively low level. The implication here is that when we're memorizing facts about a person's behavior, we don't, in fact, organize these specific behaviors by their trait implications. We don't get evidence for this kind of structure precisely because we don't see people clustering these items together by their trait implications. This is a counterintuitive result. This is not the way you would rationally build a memory system. If you were to sit down now, like Darwin, and design a memory from scratch, you build it so that it would organize stuff and cluster stuff. It's very, very, very rational, very, very efficient. It's just not how we do it. We know that as well from convergence from other kinds of experiments. Again, most of these done by Klein himself, using the kind of priming methodology that I discussed in the research by Tom Sroll. So again, the idea here is we've got nodes representing the person, James Bartlett, Judy, whatever. We've got nodes representing the person's broad, abstract personality traits. We've got other nodes representing the person's the particular behaviors. If it's the case that specific behaviors are nested underneath the traits that they exemplify, then remembering somebody's trait should prime memory for those specific behaviors. Okay? So again, let's go back to here. If I say, is James Bartlett kind? I've activated this. Activation should spread to his kind behaviors. So if I now say, did James Bartlett rescue the kitten? You want to be able to say yes very quickly because of this kind of priming effect. If knowledge of specific behaviors is organized by its trait implications, you want to get this kind of priming effect. So Klein and Loftus did another experiment. Here, most of Klein's work is on the self, and I'll talk about his work a lot when we get to that part of the course. But for example, in this particular experiment, the subjects were asked to consider people they knew well, like their mother, people they didn't know well, like a roommate they had just acquired that term or whatever. And a trait term like intelligent or kind or thoughtless was presented to them for one of three tasks. First, in one condition, they were simply asked to define the trait. What does kind mean? What does thoughtless mean? In the second condition, they were asked if a particular word described their mother. Okay, is your mother kind? Is your mother thoughtless? Is your mother whatever? Oh, well, they didn't say thoughtless. Nobody's mother is thoughtless. Mothers are good people. But all of these traits were in fact matched for social desirability and all that kind of business. So Klein knows how to do these kinds of experiments. And in the third condition, again, they were presented with a trait term like kind, and they were asked to remember a specific event in which their mother was kind or thoughtless or intelligent or whatever. Notice what the implications of this are in terms of this particular model. If I ask you that if James Bartlett is kind, answering that question will activate this node, and activation should spread to nodes representing exemplary behaviors. If I ask you if James Bartlett rescued the kitten, the only way you can get to that information is through the node representing the fact that he's kind. So again, what you've got is a specific prediction here, which is that if you get memory organized like this, you want to get priming from traits to behaviors, and you want to get priming from behaviors to traits. Okay? And that's the question here, and it turns out that the answer is quite interesting. Okay, here we are. There are some traits that the subjects had indicated were highly descriptive of their mothers, traits like intelligent and kind, presumably. Okay, and here the priming task is defining the trait, remembering an episode, or asking whether it describes their mother. We're looking at response latencies here, and what you can see is that defining the trait shows a priming effect. Okay, and remembering the trait shows a priming effect. But when you're asked to remember a particular thing, when you're asked to remember a particular event, there's no priming at all. Accessing trait information doesn't prime behavioral information, and in fact, it doesn't go the reverse way either. So there just isn't any kind of priming. That things are a little bit different when you look at those traits that were less descriptive of the subject's mothers. Here you do see a significant priming effect. So if you're asked to describe, if the word kind describes your mother, it makes it easier for you to remember a specific kind episode. Okay, compared to the control condition being asked to define the word kind. So you get priming with traits that are less descriptive of the target person, but you don't get priming with traits that are more highly descriptive of the target person. Okay, no priming here for traits that are highly descriptive of mother. A significant priming effect here for traits that are less descriptive of the mother. So again, there are some implications here. If the trait is highly descriptive of the person involved, information about that trait is encoded independently of specific behavioral information. Okay, highly descriptive traits are represented in memory independently of trait-related behaviors. But when it comes to less descriptive traits, okay, you do get this kind of organization, so that retrieval of a less descriptive trait does prime retrieval of trait-related behaviors. And the idea here is that if there's a trait that's highly descriptive of my mother, somebody says, is your mother kind? I say, oh yeah, sure, I can get right at that directly. If somebody says, well, is your mother conscientious? Oh, I've got to think about that for a second. Let me think about times when she's failed to meet her appointments or forgot my birthday or something like that. So these trait judgments are based on the retrieval of exemplary behaviors. You've got to retrieve biographical knowledge before you can make a judgment about whether the person has a trait or not. Then you do get some kinds of priming effects. But for people we know well, for traits that are highly descriptive of these people, that trait information is represented independently of behavioral information. Okay? Here's a third line of evidence. We've already had two lines of evidence. One from category clustering. We don't see when people remember behaviors, that those behaviors, recall those behaviors as clustered by their traits. We don't see the kinds of priming effects that we'd expect to see either. Here's a really clever demonstration of the independence of trait and behavioral knowledge. This, again, is work by Klein and Loftus, based on an earlier suggestion by Endel Tulving, who's a famous Canadian memory psychologist. Tulving and Klein and Loftus worked with amnesic patients who, by virtue of bilateral damage to certain brain structures, the hippocampus, other structures in the medial portion of the temporal lobe, are amnesic, which is to say that they can't remember any specific events covering a particular period of time. Tulving studied a patient known as KC, who fell off a motorcycle, wasn't wearing a helmet, hit his head, lost his entire memory for his entire life. Okay, he's still alive, has absolutely no conscious recollection of anything that's happened to him in his entire life. Nevertheless, if you ask patient KC what he's like as a person, ask him to describe himself in a bunch of trait adjectives, he knows what he's like. And we know that he knows what he's like because the way he rates himself agrees with the way other people, like his mother, who know him well, rate him as well. So here's a patient, KC, who has no episodic self-knowledge, but still has semantic self-knowledge. He still knows what he's like as a person. Klein and Loftus studied a number of such patients, and they got exactly the same kind of result. You can be completely amnesic for particular events in your life, but still be able to have some sense of what you're like as a person. You can gain access to episodic knowledge, even if you don't have any kind of trait knowledge at all. So again, the Tulving case, the case of patient KC, is even more interesting than that, because by virtue of his brain damage, KC underwent a profound personality change. Before his accident, he was a very extroverted person. That's what he was doing on a motorcycle without a helmet in the first place. Okay? After the accident, he became very introverted, very shy, very withdrawn. He underwent a marked personality change. And it turns out that KC knows what he's like now. Okay? So he has been able to encode in memory the fact that he's now a shy, introverted, withdrawn kind of person, even though he can't remember ever having engaged in shy, introverted, withdrawn behaviors because of this amnesic condition. So again, this is evidence that suggests that trait and behavioral knowledge are represented in memory independently of each other. Okay, so that takes us to basically the bottom line here with respect to the structure of person memory. We can say that within the framework of associative network theories of memory, we can represent a person just like we can represent any other piece of factual knowledge as a node in an associative network. And then the person's traits and behaviors and other things we know about that person are also represented as nodes that fan out from the person node. Okay, connected to the person node by associative links, and that trait and behavioral knowledge tend to be represented separately from each other. It's not the case, typically, it's not the case that behaviors are represented in such a way as to fan out from trait nodes. Okay, so that's basically what it looks like. This is what it looks like. It looks just like what we thought it looked like at the outset. Here's a node representing James Bartlett, fanning out to nodes. You can see where the term fan comes from, right? Fanning out to nodes representing his traits like kind and thoughtless, and also nodes fanning out representing specific behaviors like being independent. Sorry, unless anybody wants to connect to the university net. Okay, we're going to skip these couple of slides. I don't want to do this. Because I want to get to some very recent results that are really, really, really interesting. A very, very clever experiment that is kind of a once-in-a-lifetime experiment. You get to do this. It's kind of almost a psychological equivalent of a Large Hadron Collider experiment, right? You get one shot at that machine, and you got to do it. You got to do it right. How is knowledge about a person? How is person memory represented in the brain, in that mass of neurons that constitutes the brain? So far, it's been very abstract, right? We said, well, people are represented as nodes in an associative network. The implication is that there ought to be some neural representation of this as well. In psychology, we have had, for roughly the last 50, 60, 70 years, two competing theories about the neural representation of knowledge and memory. Historically, the most popular one has been a distributed representation theory that's associated with people like Carl Lashley and Donald Hebb. And the idea here is that any piece of knowledge is represented not by a discrete neuron or some discrete cluster of neurons, but rather by a pattern of neural activity that is widely distributed through the cortex, reverberating through the cortex, a holistic pattern, if you will. That is typically counterposed to what you might think an associative network how you might think an associative network is represented in memory. That is by a kind of localist structure where knowledge is recorded in the activity of a single neuron or a very small group of neurons. The localist view gets its basic idea from the analogy between a node in an associative network and a neuron in a neural network. One node, one neuron. Another node, another neuron, or a small cluster of neurons. But in any event, the distributed representation says that any piece of knowledge is distributed widely throughout cerebral cortex in a pattern of activity. The localist view says that every piece of knowledge is more locally represented, centered on a single neuron or some cluster of neurons. And as I say, based mostly on animal research, theory has mostly favored this distributed view, and I won't bore you with those details. But here's the experiment. This is work by Christoph Cook and his colleagues, taking advantage of a number of, well, taking advantage, that's the wrong word, but they took advantage of the fact that they had access to a number of patients with seizure disorders who were undergoing surgery in an attempt to alleviate their epileptic seizures. And as part of the preparation for this surgery, neurosurgeons planted a large number of electrodes, microelectrodes, in various parts of the hippocampus and the rest of the medial temporal lobe. And what they were going to do is record activity during various kinds of tasks. And you do this in neurosurgery because you want to find out if there's a particular part of the brain that's doing something important, so you won't cut it out accidentally. That's how HM got rendered amnesic, because they didn't understand what the hippocampus was all about. In any event, you've got these 8 patients who have all these microelectrodes implanted in their hippocampus and other portions of the medial temporal lobe, and they're just sitting there, right? They're conscious. They're able to interact with the staff. Cook's lab said, hey, let's do something interesting. Let's show these people pictures of familiar people and familiar objects and see if we can record the activity of specific cells or small clusters of cells activated in response to these particular objects, okay? So there are individuals, objects, animals, various kinds of landmarks, and they tailored each of these presentations to interviews with the patients themselves. So they talk to people, what do you like to do? You like to watch sports? What sports do you watch? And they say, well, I watch a lot of golf, so they put up pictures of golfers. What do you like to watch on television? Oh, I really like Friends, so they put up pictures of the stars of Friends or whatever. And then they'd record, when they presented a picture, spikes in neural activity occurring within about 1 second of the presentation of the picture. The idea being that the picture is familiar, it might activate a particular neuron or a particular cluster of neurons in the brain, and so it did. In one patient, these investigators uncovered evidence for what they called a Jennifer Aniston neuron. Okay? This was a little cluster of neurons that fired whenever a particular patient saw a picture of Jennifer Aniston. Not just this picture, but lots of pictures of Jennifer Aniston. Okay? Lots of different poses and things like that, but didn't fire to any of these other pictures that they presented. Here are the Jennifer Aniston neurons firing with her presentation of her picture. It's a single unit, as close to a single neuron as you can get, in the left posterior hippocampus of this particular patient. Another patient gave evidence for a Halle Berry neuron. Okay, here was a neuron that fired only when presented with pictures of the actress Halle Berry. Whether it was Halle Berry in Monsters Ball or Halle Berry in Catwoman, it didn't matter as long as it was a picture of Halle Berry. This single unit in the right anterior hippocampus would fire. And then finally, I didn't do this. They also found in one patient a Sydney Opera House neuron. It fired only when presented with a picture of Sydney Opera House. This is evidence that is claimed for a kind of localist representation. We sometimes joke in this field about whether people have grandmother neurons. That is, a neuron that fires whenever you think about your grandmother. And it may actually be true. Maybe not your grandmother, but maybe Jennifer Aniston and Halle Berry in the Sydney Opera House. Okay? So this is evidence that suggests that, in fact, there is some reason to take localist ideas about neural representation seriously. We may not just represent a person by a node in an associative network. We may also represent that person by a single neuron in a neural network. Thank you very much. We'll see you next week.